grab.
Don't mind if I steal your
Oh,
chair.
please, yes. This is about where I should be. Okay. Hello there at TV Land. And thanks everyone for coming this morning. How wonderful to see everyone. Oh, so many people I love are in here. So nice, and some that I hasn't met, and some I'm just meeting, and so nice to meet you all. And so I'm this person with this incredibly long last name, Wickramasekera, but you can just call me Ian. For those who don't know me, the reason I hold on to this is I love its meaning, and I love my Sri Lankan background. It means the victorious one whose name is written in the sky. So I had very humble ancestors. Not so much. But at any rate, I love to teach here at Naropa, and also I do a little adjunct work with Saybrook, and have just been committed to humanistic psychology for over 22 years. I did my first APA presentation on Kundalini Yoga and humanistic perspectives with Stanley Krippner 22 years ago. And since then have really just enjoyed exploring many areas of humanistic psychology, particularly client-centered and transpersonal traditions. Anyway, so I really, really loved Lewis's talk, and I thought it was just a really bold proclamation of where we're at and where we could go, and just a wonderful and brilliant revolution, just as he said. And so actually, as it turns out, some of the things that I'm going to be presenting on go exactly with what he was saying, and I think kind of look at the same issues but with a slightly different and complementary lens. But I'm actually going to start with some rather grim data about why what he said was so important. Because if we actually look at membership data, his argument becomes unbelievably strong, unbelievably strong. So I want to actually show you some APA membership data that really supports everything that Lewis said. Okay, but anyway, so the title of my talk is Indigenous Wisdom, Contemplative Perspectives in Neuroscience as Ways of Attracting and Empowering New and Diverse People into Humanistic Psychology. So first I want to first talk about this point about what I sometimes call the graying and shrinking of the humanistic community. And then afterwards, so we'll look at this kind of grim situation here. And then after looking at that, hopefully that will then begin to make people to think, like, what could we do to solve this problem? And so the exciting and I think hopeful message that I have is many of the difficulties we have with the shrinking of humanistic psychology and its grain, and also the fact that it's not very diverse, it really isn't. I think we can address this by looking to put more focus on indigenous wisdom in humanist psychology, contemplative perspectives in humanistic psychology, and adding neurosciences. As Lewis was so present in knowing that I would go to this area, and so thank you. We'll talk about neuroscience and neurophenomenology. All right, so that's where I'm going, and I am not a very formal person. Was that easy to tell? So please, even though this is being filmed, if you have something interesting to say or you want to ask me a question while this is going on, that would be way more fun. So please, it doesn't matter to me if I make it through this whole thing or not. If you have something you would like to say, please just say. If you have a question, then that would be fun too. Okay, so first, let's look at the grim realities. In 2012, the APA president, Susan Bennett Johnson, and here's a nice picture of her, warned that the aging of APA's membership represented a potential crisis. What is the actual data? Well, in 2012, the average age of APA members was 54. I'm given to understand now this number has, I think, edged up closer to 60. So what this means is young people are not entering the APA and not being involved in APA divisions. So here's a quote from her from the APA Monitor in April of 2012. Unless we engage the next generation of psychologists, the APA will no longer be the influential organization it is today. And this was even before the terrible scandals, right? With, oh my goodness. So as it goes, this is really something to worry about. But I'm here to tell you, it's even worse. It's even worse in the humanistic community. Let's look at some of that data, okay? So according to APA membership records, the average age of members of the Society of Humanistic Psychology, Division 32, has been around 65 for the past 5 years, even higher than the general trend in the APA at large. Now, if you want to contextually understand, I can tell you another division I'm involved with, the Society of Psychological Hypnosis. It's even worse. The average age is 70, so maybe that makes me feel a little better. But still, my goodness, this is bad. This means that if the average age is that high, it means we really need to empower and bring new blood into the field, or it's really going to die. And actually, in a little second here, I'm going to show you some evidence to show you that it already has been dying since 1980. Since 1980. And along the way, I will show you some wonderful people who have been presidents of the division recently. And here is my good friend Krishna Kumar, who is a past president of the Society of Humanistic Psychology. And he is well known in the hypnosis community as well. And not everyone in the humanistic community knows this, but he is one of the world's leading researchers in phenomenological hypnosis. That's how I met him many years ago, I guess about 20 years ago. And also he's a great creativity researcher. So he's really known for establishing actual measures of phenomenology that can be used in measuring altered states of consciousness. He in fact worked with one of my other great mentors, Ron Bacala, to establish an instrument called the Phenomenology of Consciousness Inventory, which is why you can actually measure states of consciousness, any state of consciousness, not just hypnosis. He's used it for shamanic drumming, he's used it for firewalking, and all kinds of things. And also he's done this great creativity and hypnosis research as well. Okay, so let's get another piece of data. So according to APA membership records, people of color have remained around 5% of Division 32's total membership in the last 3 years. And I went back another 2 years, and it's about the same number, between 5 and 7% or something like that. And so, what are you going to say? Like all people of color is like 5, 6, 7%. Can it be said that humanistic psychology is advanced beyond the position of tokenism? In terms of including people of color in its activities. I mean, I don't mean to, say something that sounds a little, but I mean, that's really how it is. That's really how it is. And, I've been involved in the division for 22 years, and it's always been about the same, And I have to tell you, only in the last 10 years have I myself felt particularly included in things. And that's been by some really great people, some of whom are in this room, who have really helped me in that. But really, I would think in, maybe the first 10, 15 years I was involved in the division, I felt incredibly invisible. I mean, it was really amazing. One time I gave a spirituality and hypnosis talk that was in symposia in which Stan Krippner was on this, and Charlie Tart in San Francisco. We had over 500 people in the room. This was like, this was like 2008 or something in San Francisco. And yet, still to this day, many people in the division act like I just started 5 years ago. I've been doing this for 22 years. So there's something going on there. There really is. And I'm not meaning to say this to discourage people. I'm saying we really need to work more on inclusiveness, because I'm not the only one. There are many other, particularly transpersonal people of color and researchers who have done like whole lifetimes of research that had never been acknowledged by the division. At any rate, I just thought I would mention that. Then here is another previous past president, Sean Rubin, who's done a lot of great work in really trying to bring social justice perspectives in inclusiveness into Division 32. All right, now here is a really grim thing. Here is actual membership data from Division 32. This is 1980. This is when we peaked. It was 1,032. And by 1990, 10 years later, it had gone down to 725. Here's 2000, 670. Here's 2010, 509. Here's 2016, that was the last year I was able to pull, most recent, 411. Now, the optimistic part of me says, well, look, you know, the curve is actually flattening a little bit. You know, we're not losing as many people as we once did. Yay! But this is truly showing just, what Lewis said was exactly right. We need to do a lot more. We need to do everything he said and more to get this number at least back to where it once was back in, I mean, you have to remember the context of humanistic psychology in 1980 was much less favorable than it is now. Much less favorable. Yeah, you know, Skinner was still alive saying we were the worst thing ever in 1980, and half the APA believed that, actually. You know, when he talked about what was wrong with psychology in particular. If you remember his farewell address to the APA, he particularly said that psychology was being ruined by humanistic psychology. Now, this is laughable to all of us in this room, but at the time he said it, a large number of people in APA really believed that. So how is it that the context of humanistic psychology, I believe, is much improved now? We don't even have a Skinner to worry about. Well, look at this. What's gone wrong? Everything that Lewis said, everything that he said is exactly what went wrong. And this data really shows it. And it's probably, and more things need to be done. Okay, so that's some of the grim realities. I think I have one more grim reality and then we'll be over that part, okay? So we desperately need to attract new and diverse members, just like Lewis said. And as I showed you by the numbers, our membership actually peaked over 30 years ago, in 1980. So people of color are still participating in the society at very low levels. And here is our good current president, Donna Rockwell, who is well known for her love of social justice things and also for her love of contemplative methods of practicing with humanistic psychology, including, in particular, mindfulness meditation. Okay, so what does this mean? It's time to reach out to new members, just as Lewis said. Just as Lewis said. We need to grow the field by making it more relevant to new groups of people, just like you were talking about that book chapter, why I dropped out of humanistic psychology. If it ain't relevant to the way that you experience the world, then you don't stick around, you know? And so, in fact, one of the big arguments I'm going to be making today is that we need to make humanistic psychology relevant to indigenous peoples and indigenous wisdom in particular. And then we could spread around the world in a way that no other tradition of psychology, I believe, has the same potential. All right, so we need to make this field more relevant by making it more relevant to new groups of people, not just the same things that we've been doing. This is not to say that we shouldn't keep doing the same things that we've been doing. They're wonderful and great. But, you know, we need to make space. So we need to be more relevant to people of color in particular and members of other oppressed groups as well. And here is our president-elect, Nathaniel Granger, also the secretary of this particular society, and such a wonderful and great person who's well known for his social justice perspectives and research on microaggressions, and just an overall fantastic person. So we need to expand the domain of humanistic psychology beyond the traditional definitions of the field as existential, humanistic, and transpersonal traditions. And so the grim part is over, and now I want to talk about the exciting things of the future, at least for me. I believe that we can really do this by expanding our focus on indigenous wisdom, contemplative perspectives, and neuroscience. So some of these things sound like anathema to, I don't know, more purist, or I don't know if I want to say purist. I will actually say dichotomous views of humanistic psychology say that neuroscience should not be a part of the humanistic tradition, and I'll make an argument for that when we get to it. Okay, so first let us begin by looking at indigenous wisdom and how that could perhaps help us with expanding the domain and scope. So, one of the first things I wanted to mention is that, humanistic psychology as a tradition in the West, we have a fairly long tradition, it's really not quite even 100 years, I guess, but, maybe we could go back to someone like Jung, and there's other folks, and we could say it's like maybe 100 years or something like that. Or, I don't know, maybe we could even go back to Abbe Faria in 1819, who was a Goan priest that was interested in hypnosis and states of consciousness, and say maybe that's 200 years of humanistic and transpersonally oriented therapy ideas. Meanwhile, we know that indigenous people have been thinking about what causes suffering and what is the nature of this thing we call the self for over 18,000 years. 18,000 years. That means that was in the Pleistocene era. We're talking another geological epoch of time, the Pleistocene era. And we know that there are actually representatives of these traditions. They are still alive. You can meet them. Even here in Boulder, you can meet a lot of them in Boulder. It's a very nice thing about Boulder, actually. You can meet these people. You can hear the wisdom that was passed to them from their teachers, going back in lineages thousands of years old. I myself was touched by a text that was written 1,200 years ago by a Tibetan teacher. So these wisdom lineages, they are still alive. And you know what? They have a lot of things to say about the nature of the self that we experience and about the causes of human suffering that are completely related to humanistic psychology. So let's take a look at some of this, okay? Oh, and what you're looking at here, this is a Tibetan practitioner of the tradition called Chud practice. And what you can see here, he is blowing a rather grim instrument. It's a thigh bone trumpet. He uses this to summon the spirits, and he has a drum here to entertain different kinds of deities and things. And then in his practice, he imagines that he is transforming himself into this kind of spiritual dakini person, dakini warrior, almost like an enlightened female aspect. And then he offers his body, speech, and mind, even his body chopped into bits, to the entire universe, so that all beings can be free of suffering. So it's practicing a form of transcendental generosity. It's very interesting to imagine the idea of actually, almost like a Lord of Jesus Christ, you offer your body, speech, mind so that all will not suffer. Very interesting, this concept of offering all that you have so that others will not suffer was not just the invention of Lord Jesus Christ. Also, in many other traditions and shamanic traditions have been doing the same similar notion in the practice of Chud. And so this, in fact, is an indigenous wisdom tradition that I have studied using phenomenology. And so I'll get to that study in just a little bit. At any rate, so many indigenous peoples of the world have, in fact, come up with ideas about the nature of self and the nature of suffering in this world that are quite similar to what we see in client-centered and existential and transpersonal traditions. So in particular, in the Chud practice, there is this notion that the reason why we suffer in life is due to the illusion of self. This is a primary idea, particularly in the transpersonal tradition, and pretty much all humanistic traditions say that we have some kind of deeper nature we can reach. Like in the client-centered tradition, there's this notion that we have this thing called the actualizing tendency. And this is something that's deep within us, and that actually all that it needs to elicit the spontaneous love and wisdom of the individual is simply to provide a nourishing arrangement around them by giving them empathy, positive regard, and honesty and transparency, and then spontaneously wisdom and love emerges. And this is very similar to the notion that we have in the Chud tradition and of Tibetan Buddhism and Hmong, that actually human beings are relating to the world and experience suffering, not because of anything other than the foolishness to keep believing in this illusion of self. And in fact, we have a deeper nature that can be reached, and you can use contemplative perspectives and practices to actually do that. And the Trent tradition is one of them. You try to abandon the sense of clinging to the self through offering your body, speech, and mind so that all sentient beings, without exception, especially your enemies, will be free of all suffering. So not only is it a tradition that has this idea, it has practices that are actually designed to help you experience the going beyond the clinging to ourselves. Very interesting, very challenging actually to do these practices. All right, so transpersonal theorists in particular have been talking about the similarities between indigenous wisdom cultures and humanistic psychology for decades. And so here's one of the most noted tricksters in this. This is my good friend and mentor, Stan Krippner, who I first met at a parapsychology conference in 1986, where I asked him if he could make me a Ghostbuster. I was in high school, and I said, I was supposed to write this paper on what do you want to be when you grow up, and I was 16 years old, and I said, can you make me a Ghostbuster, Dr. Krippner? Then he said, that would be a terrible idea, Ian. You'll lose your shirt. Why don't you become a clinical psychologist instead who studies parapsychology and transpersonal psychology, and that would be a much better life. And thank God he told me that, because here I am now. Although, to be honest, I think things have changed in that field. There are actually ways to make a living as a parapsychologist, besides being the correspondent for ancient aliens or something. All right, so here we are in Hawaii, and here's this other trickster person, that's me. And this is my other great trickster friend, Eric Wilmarth, a Saybrook faculty member. And we're all utterly and slavishly devoted to humanistic views of hypnosis in particular. All right, so Stan really pioneered this area. I mean, he has done so many studies of how humanistic psychology is relevant to indigenous wisdom in Tibetan traditions like I have done, but so much further than that. He's looked at shamanism in Native Americans all over South America, Africa, Candomblé, all kinds of any culture. In fact, one time I was with Stan and I asked him how many countries in the world had he not visited, and there was only one. I was like, my God, here is someone who has devoted his entire life and even helped invent the field of cross-cultural psychology. And by the way, very prominent social justice activist, knew Martin Luther King, gave Martin Luther King his first tour of Northwestern University back in the 1950s, and has been involved in social justice movements since that time continuously, and even things that people don't think as much about involving the rights of indigenous people to be free from factory farming in South America, all kinds of things. He's done all kinds of activism, anti-nuclear war, many things, Green Party kind of stuff. Really amazing person and model for me, at least hero for me, I guess. Anyway, so he has really pioneered this field. So now let me tell you about some of the things that I have done. In 2004, I wrote a paper which appeared in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, in which I compared the tradition of client-centered psychotherapy to the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And in particular, I was interested in comparing the role of being a Buddhist teacher. The Sanskrit term for this is Kalyana Mitra, which means spiritual friend. Isn't that nice? I would be spiritual friends, It's a kind of a humble kind of term, right? Spiritual friends. Let's be spiritual friends. And then compared that, the role of what it means to be a spiritual friend within Tibetan Buddhism and Bhutan, to client-centered psychotherapy. And in particular, there are tremendous similarities in perspective on what it means to be a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism. And I use mostly, well, actually, this is a very embodied way to say this. I mostly used the criteria of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who started this very university that we're in at this moment. How about that? So he actually had a lot of writings that talked about how he felt a teacher should be. And it turns out that most of his criteria for who could actually teach meditation and be a contemplative teacher were very similar to perspectives that we have about congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy as the criteria of being a client-centered psychotherapist. So in particular, maybe I'll just mention one of them here in the interest of time. In Buddhism, we have this term that's called Maitri. And Maitri is just a wonderful word. It means something like unlimited friendliness. Doesn't that sound nice? It says that if you really want to be a Buddhist teacher, you should, or a Bon teacher for that matter, you should have this quality of unlimited friendliness with the people that you work with. Doesn't that sound so similar to the notion of unconditional positive regard? That we would be capable of listening to anything that a person would present to us, and would be capable of responding with warmth and sympathy and prizing. So that's the term Maitri. But even with the other two terms, we have great Buddhist perspectives on that as well. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send you the reference from 2004. I should also mention, however, I wasn't just interested in pursuing the similarities, I was interested in pursuing the differences too. And so there are some interesting differences. And I think they're kind of interesting in terms of maybe how we might change humanistic psychology for me as well. So one thing was, there's definitely a difference in Tibetan Buddhism and Bon on non-directivity. This notion that we shouldn't use, in particular, techniques. In some of Roger's original writings, he really emphasizes this idea that you don't actually need to use any techniques. You just need to provide this nourishing environment and people get better. And so he has this long list of naughty no-nos you shouldn't get involved with. And one of them happens to be hypnosis. Oh no. Because I do a lot of that. And so in this long list of things you shouldn't use as techniques. And I don't know. I think there's been a lot of arguments being made that maybe some of the ideas that he had around techniques were kind of based on this notion of techniques about taking power over people, Whereas the way that I understand meditation and self-hypnosis these are ways of getting people into their own power and empowering them that way. And that's the way that all my hypnosis research has really shown that, in fact, people who use hypnosis are not suggestible, they're empathizing with themselves rather instead. In fact, if you want to know who's really good at hypnosis, it is not people who are suggestible, it is people who are actually highly empathic. So, anyway, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. But so there's a difference there on this non-directivity, and I think that could be something we might want to reevaluate. There may be some role for helping teach people coping skills and ways of generating insight like meditation and hypnosis. Also, another interesting thing is the notion of devotion. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a lot of emphasis of devotion, just like there is in client-centered psychotherapy, for the teacher to the student. So the teacher in Tibetan Buddhism and in Bon really devotes themselves completely to the student. That's supposed to be the ideal of this. In fact, some teachers even wear a kind of mirror, what they call a malong, a kind of mirror. It's used for a lot of different reasons, but one of the symbols of it is that you're supposed to be a mirror to your students. You're supposed to mirror back to them who they are. Doesn't that sound a lot like what a client-centered psychotherapist is supposed to be doing? However, not only in Tibetan Buddhism is the teacher supposed to be devoted to the student, but also the student is given instructions about how to devote themselves to the relationship as well. That's something that we don't actually really have in client-centered psychotherapy as a way of telling people, here's how you can devote yourself to the therapy. Does it never happen? Of course it doesn't. No, I'm just kidding. I was involved in client-centered psychotherapy myself for 3 years, and by the end of that, I was so devoted to that therapy. No one had to tell me how to devote myself to it. It just had so much value that I kept going. Every session to me seemed like an amazing acid trip where I really learned so much about myself. I had to wait about 20 minutes in the waiting room afterwards just to kind of get grounding again, because this was really a very powerful therapy for me, and I was very devoted to it. So even though we don't particularly tell our clients that they should be devoted to the therapy, nevertheless, I think it happens by the nature of the relationship. But interestingly enough, near as I can tell, I haven't found any writings from Roger, at least, about how we tell clients to prize the therapy. There's certainly a lot of us prizing the therapy as the therapist, but in terms of asking the clients to prize it, don't really have that. And here is Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay, so now I want to briefly talk about a study I did a couple of years back, looking at chud meditation, which I had already started to tell you. And here, Clark Mustafa, whose phenomenological qualitative method is the one that I used in this study. It's a really great method if you haven't studied it before, because it's highly integratable with clinical treatment. It's the one method of qualitative analysis that I know that if you learn how to do this method, it will make you a better therapist. And so it's the only method that I teach, because when I'm teaching folks research methods, I want them to learn techniques that will feel integratable with their clinical work. You don't have to, of course, do that. There are other great methods that are less integratable and actually have other excellent properties. But Clark Mustakas, if you learn to do this, not only will it help you to do great research, it can make you a better clinician. At any rate, so as I was saying earlier, chud is very similar to many traditions of hypnosis and transpersonal psychology. In particular, we know that chud meditation engaged in what we call, Stan Krippner developed this term in a classic paper called The Trance and the Trickster. Hypnotic-like experiences, hypnotic-like visualizations. So while you're engaged in the chud practice, you visualize, I'll go back to the visualization, that you're actually been transformed into this particular deity. In the Bhutan tradition, this deity is called Khalzing Ma. And Khalzing Ma comes and has this big hooked knife here. And then she comes and just chops your head right off. Pow! Wow! And you lost your head, and then she chops your arm off, and then your other arm, then your legs, and she chops you into little bits, and then opens your skull, and then puts all the blood and the flesh inside your skull, and cooks it on a fire, and you can kind of see this is what's happened here, the previous sacrifices that people have made of themselves. And then this is your body, speech, and mind is transformed into a beautiful and a tasty kind of stew. Here you can see some eyeballs are popping out. I guess it was real hot. And so the eyeballs are popping out. But this stew is offered to all sentient beings through all the universes of the three times, the past, present, and the future, so that all suffering may be relieved. And here you can see she's not very nice. She's standing on this woman. But actually, no, this woman is her. So this is the transformation. The person has transformed into their enlightened, most loving form of Khalzing Ma. So a lot of indigenous psychology is so easy to misunderstand. You might think, who is this horrible deity standing on a woman? Actually, the deity is the woman. There's a lot of secrets involved with the iconography of Tibetan art and many indigenous cultures' art. People say, that looks so savage and so primitive, but actually it's a very sophisticated psychology. More indigenous wisdom will change humanistic psychology. Because if you properly understand this, you'll see they're making insights into the nature of self that, thousands of years before transpersonal psychology and humanistic psychology in general were around. And it's all embodied in the symmetry. Anyway, so the person will actually engage in hypnotic-like visualization of transforming themselves into Khalzing Ma, and this will cause alterations in consciousness, enhanced attention, involuntariness, and feelings of love. Oh, how about that? Feelings of love. Love. How wonderful. We could use that word in a research way. Yes, people report feelings of love in the study that I did, which are commonly reported during this experience. And also, all of these things come up all the time in hypnosis. Not just in this. We know that when we look at, and actually here's some of the research done by Krishna Kumar was talking about, Ron Pakal and Krishna Kumar, have shown with their phenomenological research on hypnosis that all of these things that people experience in Chud meditation are the same things that people actually experience in hypnosis. So we can say that Chud is a hypnotic-like experience, using Stan's old term. Okay, so interestingly enough, most of you probably wouldn't know this, but there are many traditions of hypnosis in terms of research perspectives. So I'm representing the transpersonal one, but there's also one called the social cognitive one. But one thing that both the social cognitive and transpersonal traditions of hypnosis have postulated is that the everyday experience of self that we have is a kind of believed in imagining. Oop. Oop. Let's see. Okay, what did I do here? Oh, here we go. Okay. We think that the experience of self is a kind of believed in imagining. The reason why we say this from a hypnotic perspective is that we've done a lot of research on what this concept of the self is in hypnosis. You can actually alter the self quite readily with hypnosis. We have these wonderful experiments recently being done in Australia and New Zealand, where actually we have people in a state of hypnosis to role play being someone else. And then we see the degree to which they're actually able to make that transformation. Some people can do it so well that their startle response is diminished. So that if we bring in, the orienting response is diminished. So that we'll tell somebody, you're no longer who you are, you're this different person, and then we'll bring in their friends and loved ones. And then if you, I don't know if you know this, but if someone walks in this room who you already know, then you'll have this thing called an orienting response that'll show in your heart rate. You know, that you go, oh, there's my friend. You know, like if my high school friend Dustin walked in the room, I'm sure I'd have a huge one. We used to smoke together all the time. And I'm like, oh, Dustin, it's so nice to see you. And then there'd be this orienting response. Or now that I'm looking at Louise smiling, oh, there's Louise. You know, how wonderful. When people make this transformation in hypnosis, the orienting response is gone or diminished. So we've done a lot of research in hypnosis that shows just how illusory this experience of self can be. It can be altered by hypnosis, it can be altered by Chud practice. And so we refer to this in the hypnotic tradition, and it's not just me, you know, this phrase was come up by a guy who was cognitive behavioral, by the way. He said that the self is a kind of believed in imagining. So he's not saying that you fake the role of being in hypnosis, but you believe in it. Actually, his critical term is with hallucinated intensity. So it's a believed in imagining with hallucinated intensity. And this is exactly what the Bon and the Buddhist masters have been saying for thousands of years, that actually the self is an illusory thing that causes you to suffer. And if you would just relate to your basic inner nature without grasping, then you would have so much more love and wisdom. Okay, and I've written all about this in different papers if anyone's interested. And this is Guru Taparista, who is always shown naked. Isn't that interesting? Was it because he was some kind of exhibitionist? No. The iconography shows him naked because he was devoid of conceptual thought, and he was devoid of conceptual identity. And so he is shown naked in that way. He is not clothed with thoughts, he is not clothed with identity, he has transcended these things. And he's also shown inside the kind of rainbow sphere. Okay, now let us go to why might this be helpful? Why might this be helpful to think about indigenous wisdom in terms of attracting new and diverse members? Well, the argument that I'm making is we can better appeal to diverse people by honoring their indigenous wisdom. You know, especially if you're trying to reach out to international groups and people of color and people of different oppressed groups. A lot of times, what is the thing that's gotten them through those experiences of oppression? It's been their indigenous wisdom cultures, you know, it's been their spiritual and religious beliefs. So we really should be reaching far out, really far out. I mean, so I've done all this work in terms of Bon and Tibetan Buddhism, and that's just scratching the surface. We should be doing a lot more of this in terms of contemplate, like Stan has done, and just like Stan has done, go around the world and find all the different ways and all the indigenous wisdom traditions and talk about how they're related to humanistic psychology. We need more people like Stan who've been doing this, almost like, I don't know, humanistic psychology missionaries, but actually not a missionary. I had some problems with what they did. But at any rate, So we do need people who are good ambassadors to humanistic psychology that actually respect the indigenous wisdom traditions of people from around the world. And when we honor people's indigenous wisdom, then I believe we will get more of them in our traditions, you know. And so when we do that, we really show everyone, not just the people from indigenous wisdom cultures, but we show everyone, you know, regardless of what your background is, that humanistic tradition really is an inclusive tradition. We're not just saying it, so that we can actually know we've become inclusive by the degree to which we're inviting people with different viewpoints into our tradition. So I have a great example of this. These are, quite possibly, there may be eventually at some point some Bhutanese folks watching this. So I want to say a special hello to you. But so for the last 2 years, I've been involved in teaching humanistic psychology and counseling in Bhutan. And the reason why this happened was they wanted to have their very first offer their very first master's in counseling. And they were so excited to start this program, but they didn't want just any old counseling or just any old psychology being taught there. They wanted something that really respected their indigenous beliefs. So who did they turn to? They turned to Nairobi University. And that's because Nairobi University was founded by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who had a special relationship with the country of Bhutan. Almost all of his most powerful insights were received in transmissions at a special cave in Bhutan called Taksang. At any rate, so they turned to the university that they knew Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche had founded, and they knew that we had a counseling program that respected indigenous wisdom of Buddhism in particular. And we call it our Contemplative and Transpersonal departments, and we have other traditions here too that all do that. And so they, the first people to go and teach these master's students from Europa were, here is me, and my good friend Kathleen and Gregory, also the Dean of the Graduate School of Counseling Psychology here at Naropa. And then here are some of the students and some of our Bhutanese faculty that we were working alongside with. Here's Dechen Drolma, she's going to be the new Dean. And then here's Wang Chuk, and so if any of them are watching, hello. But at any rate, so it's been so wonderful to really be with these folks because I have learned so much more than I've taught. So much more about a completely different way of looking at the world. So, you know, I went over there thinking I was going to be teaching humanistic and, you know, contemplative psychology, and instead it has changed my life 100%, and I have learned so much. And how did that happen? Because I opened myself to learning from them, and then in particular, because I was already knowledgeable about how Buddhism related to humanistic psychology, then I fit right in there, and they welcomed me and even offered me to become like a member of their society and wear even their traditional go garb, and so really treat me like a family member. This, I think, is the real way we should be teaching humanistic psychology internationally, completely integrated with the indigenous views of the people who are learning it. Do we really want to teach them humanistic psychology the way it was conceived of in California hot tubs? Well, maybe. Actually, it doesn't sound too bad. Right? Actually, the Esalen part doesn't sound so bad. But on the other hand, I think we really should be open to what they have to learn too. They actually have their own kind of hot tubs there. They have hot stone baths. They're very nice. Anyway, so there's some ideas about that. And again, I really think this is such a wonderful thing that we really could make the humanistic psychology diverse in an incredibly meaningful way by doing this. That will not just be about promulgating humanistic psychology, but changing humanistic psychology and honoring, 18,000 years of wisdom that came before humanistic psychology was even, an inkling in the Esalen hot tub. All right, now let us talk briefly about contemplative perspectives. And here's a nice picture of Shauna Shapiro, who is a humanistic psychology that's done so much great research on mindfulness meditation. One of her collaborators is Roger Walsh. So contemplative psychology, for those of you who are not familiar with that word and how it relates to humanistic psychology, I have given a definition of it. I like to think of it as the tradition that has to do with mind-body practices that are said to develop a person's innate ability to experience wisdom and love. That's how I define it. And the reason why I say that is because here you have the C-O-N, with, and temple. So it's like being with your inner temple. The transpersonal tradition in particular, and contemplative, and other humanistic traditions say, you know, you don't need to bring the wisdom to the person, you need to help them connect with the wisdom that they already have. And if you would do that, then that would be enough. And so in contemplative psychology, we teach people mind-body practices that suit them. And one of the most popular ones that we generally tend to teach is mindfulness meditation these days. And so Shauna Shapiro's done a great job of looking at the possibilities of that. Though I should mention here that contemplative practices are not just mindfulness meditation. That is one of, according to Nagarjuna, 84,000 contemplative practices exist, at least according to Nagarjuna in Buddhism. And, you know, probably the number is as infinite as you're willing to invent a new technique, you know. So also I would include things like yoga, hypnosis, and you know, biofeedback, anything that helps people to develop their innate wisdom and love. Shamanic practices, psychedelic investigations, microdosing, I know all of these, I think we could make an argument, can be a contemplative practice for people. Anything that develops wisdom and love. Okay, so one way that I have written about this myself is that mindfulness, hypnosis, and other contemplative practices offer humanistic practitioners, and again, there is this little naughty no-no about non-directivity, so I'll just mention that, a way of increasing empathy, insight, and coping skills. Not just for the client, for yourself. In fact, we have great research that shows if you practice mindfulness meditation and techniques like hypnosis in particular, in my own research, we know it actually increases people's empathy. Isn't that interesting? You can actually develop more empathy, not just by being a therapist, but actually by using contemplative practices when no one else is around. You can develop more insight into yourself, and also, in general, these things increase the parasympathetic tone of your autonomic nervous system. So they help you to reduce stress. So not only do they make you a better therapist and a happier person, they will actually help you with coping with the difficulties of life. And here's my favorite go, the black one. I enjoyed this. Now one thing to say about why does this help humanistic psychology? Well, Donna Rockwell really showed us last year how popular mindfulness meditation, actually for a number of years, has really showed us how popular mindfulness meditation is. I think one of the most heavily attended sessions in all of last year was Donna Rockwell's presentation on mindfulness. And so I think there had been well over 300 people in that room. It may have been more like 500. And this is, I think that was maybe the second or third year that was the same thing. Just huge numbers of people coming. So contemplative perspectives and contemplative practice, even independent of a spiritual or religious point of view, because there are a lot of cognitive behavioral people who are interested in mindfulness meditation that aren't so interested in the you know, like Teasdale, Siegel, and Williams kind of stuff. They show that using mindfulness in a cognitive behavioral way really helps even any kind of therapy. It adds variance to helping people in the experiments. And so she really showed us that just how popular this could be when so many people arrived there that I know probably didn't go to any other Division 32 event last year at the APA conference, and yet they came for this one. So this really could help in terms of expanding the domain. All right, so then I'll just go into this last one and then we'll finish up and I'll make a little time for questions. I just want to look at the area of neurosciences. Louis promised that I would. And so this is in fact one of my great loves in life. I just love neuroscience. And I don't care if it is naughty, I like it. Maybe I like it because it's naughty. I don't know, it could be the way my mind works. Interesting, talking about the way a mind works, and I love this image, right? Because it really shows the way a mind works is by, we put people in our world. This is what object relations means in psychoanalysis. We're constantly putting people in our world. So just look around the room at everyone. Just turn around and look. Everyone you see is a part of your mind. Not one. If there's someone that's there that you don't see, they didn't make it in your mind. That would be your implicit bias, so stop that. You should see them. When the minorities talk about being invisible, that's what this means. They didn't make it in there. So everyone you see is in your mind. If you didn't see them, that's your implicit bias. Or maybe explicit, I don't know. Anyway, so neuroscience has really changed remarkably in the last 20 years. There is increasing emphasis on the need to, as Lewis was saying, to study phenomenology, the study of the brain. I have an article or two on this. The new paradigm, as Lewis had said, is called neurophenomenology. And the real reason for why this came up was we had all of these great fMRI research about what the brain does doing different things. And I'll tell you one really funny one. We have probably well over, I don't know, 100-some studies looking at hypnosis and how we reduce pain using hypnotic analgesia. The person learns how to control their pain response using hypnosis. You might think, such a thing, is that really possible? And yeah, it is. I had chronic migraine headaches myself growing up, and I'm standing here because of that. They used to completely debilitate me, make me nauseous and anxious and all of this. And so we know that when people use hypnosis to work on the pain response, there are two structures of the brain that are involved. I'm just going to talk about one of them. It's the anterior cingulate cortex. So the anterior cingulate cortex actually reduces your emotional experience of pain. And so the first person to show that was Pierre Rainville, and he published that in the Journal of Science, the journal that is called Science, the highest journal of science by the American Academy of Sciences, for the American Academy for the Advancement of the Sciences, a journal for which I'll probably never get an article in my whole life, or I don't know, maybe I will. But at any rate, this is the highest journal. I mean, this is where like all this quark and black hole physics stuff is showing up. And so Pierre Rainville got this study in Science. So we thought, oh, this is great. Finally, we have a marker that uniquely of how hypnosis reduces pain. And so we thought this is going to be great. And then we discovered some other weird things. That when people use mindfulness to try and deal with chronic pain, guess which structure of the brain was involved? The anterior cingulate cortex. And so also when people use relaxation to get over pain, it was the anterior cingulate. And when people use EMDR to reduce the experience of PTSD, it was the anterior cingulate. And then there were all kinds of studies that showed that if you used things to deal with any kind of negative emotion or negative physical experience, it was the anterior cingulate. And so now we have this problem. Carl Pribram, a great neuroscientist and hypnosis researcher, wrote this paper one time. It was called Suddenly Cingulate. And it was just like all of these studies that showed that we had no idea what the cingulate was doing because it did so many things. And why didn't they know what it was doing? Because no one bothered to ask people what they were experiencing while they were in the fMRI scanner. And if we had just asked people while they were in the scanner what they were doing, what they were experiencing, then we might have some way of constraining this neurological data with some phenomenological information about the patterns of experience that people have. And so no one did it. And so because of that, we have all this decades of useless fMRI research. And we don't know what it means. We don't actually know what people were really doing and experiencing. And you need phenomenology to understand neuroscience, particularly fMRI research. And so that's where the field of neurophenomenology came from. It actually didn't come from, it came from neuroscientists who liked phenomenology, but it didn't actually come from humanistic psychology. But it's a great opportunity for humanistic psychology to enter neuroscience as equal partners. Because who knows phenomenology better than us, right? We got Clark Moustakas, Amadeo Giorgi, all of this stuff, So we really can enter neuroscience now, and there's a demand for us, actually. So I just want to illustrate one other thing, which is how neurophenomenology can actually not necessarily resolve, but investigate these amazing things that we think about all the time. Basic concepts like what is the self? So in neurophenomenology, they've done some really remarkable studies that have shown that seem to indicate where this thing we call the self, or the selves, depending on what your experience is, come from. It's interesting. So there's a structure, or a network of structures in the brain called the default mode network. And here's some of the primary parts of it. So our good friend the hippocampus, or the hippocampus, like Naropa, I guess, is here. This has to do with how you remember who you think you are and the story that you tell of being on the hippocampus, I guess. And then, let's see, where's our friend? The anterior cingulate I was talking about is here. And so this is really about how we deal with ourselves and understand ourselves and plan different things. But we know that the experience of self emerges from this network. And this is also where, like if you just sit quietly and wait for a thought to come, like there's first one, Scooby-Doo.